If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to episode 29. In this episode, we speak with author Nuzo Onoh. Before we get started, I just want to say real quick, you should check out our new YouTube channel. We have recently put that up, and if you prefer listening to our show on YouTube, that is now a thing that is available to you. Also, we all have some conferences coming up soon. If you're interested in seeing those or seeing recordings of those, we usually keep that sort of thing updated on Twitter. So just a little bit of a reminder there. And as you may have already noticed, I'm rolling alone today. So we'll see how that goes. So our guest today again is Nuzo Onoh, and we'll be back in 1 minute. Solarpunk Futures is a podcast about building radically hopeful futures through storytelling and exploration of the solarpunk genre. The podcast features readings of science fiction stories, poetry, and articles published in Solarpunk magazine, as well as interviews with authors, activists, artists, futurists, and others from the solarpunk community who are envisioning and actively creating a better future. You can find Solarpunk Futures anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also listen directly on our website at solarpunkmagazine.com. Okay, and we are back. Our guest today is Nuzo Onoh. She is a Nigerian-British writer of Igbo descent. She's a pioneer of the African horror literary subgenre, hailed as the queen of African horror. Nuzo's writing showcases both the beautiful and horrific in the African culture with fictitious narratives. Her books, The Reluctant Dead and Unhallowed Graves, are both collections of ghost stories depicting core Igbo traditions, beliefs, and superstitions. Very interesting sounding. She's also the author of the novels The Sleepless, Dead Corpse, The Unclean, which is a personal favorite of mine, A Dance for the Dead, and the nonfiction work Call on Your Ancestors for Happiness and Success. Nuzo's works have featured in numerous magazines, podcasts, and anthologies, and she is listed in the reference book 80 Black Women in Horror. She has given talks and lectures about African horror, including the prestigious Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies in London. Her works have also appeared in academic and feminist studies, such as Routledge Handbook of African Literature, Horror Fiction in the Global South, Cultures, Narratives, and Representations, and Women Write About Comics. Her novellas have been longlisted twice by the British Science Fiction Association, shortlisted by NAMU Awards, and recommended by the Locus magazine reading list. Nuzo is the first African horror writer to have featured in Starburst magazine, the world's longest-running magazine of cult entertainment. Nuzo also holds a law degree and a master's degree in writing, both from Warwick University, United Kingdom. She is also a certified civil funeral celebrant, licensed to conduct non-religious burial services. An avid musician with an addiction to Zhang Yup and K-indie pop music, Nuzo plays both the guitar and piano, and holds an NVQ in digital music production from City College, Coventry. She currently resides in the West Midlands, UK, with her cat, Tinkerbell. So welcome, Nuzo.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely. It's such a delight to have you here. I've been a huge fan of your work since I first heard of it in Ogenechevwe, Donald Ekpeki's, and Zelda Knight's anthology, Dominion. I know everybody loves all of those stories, but your story, The Unclean, just really, really jumped out to me. And I'm not even a big horror fan, so that's really something, I have to say.
Oh, thank you so much, Alan. I'm really, really touched. Thank you. I always feel very humbled when I hear people saying, especially people who are not from my culture, saying they connect with the stories, because I think that's exactly why I write, trying to show a different kind of horror from the mainstream one we're all used to. So thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I want you to know you are the first horror writer we've ever had on this podcast.
Really?
Absolutely, yes. I gotta say, I mostly focus on fantasy and science fiction. I don't know why particularly. I grew up loving horror. Horror was really one of my first speculative fiction loves, but I kind of grew away from it as I got older.
Ah, as you grew older, you sort of found yourself drifting to the other end, science fiction rather than horror.
Yeah, yeah. I have no good explanation for that. That's just how it went,
That is so strange. Do you know, sometime when I was a teenager, I actually got into science fiction. I was reading Robert Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Place.
Hmm.
That was the first one I read, and then Dune. And I loved science fiction at that time in my teenage years. And I don't know what happened. I lost the interest and found myself going back again to my childhood love of horror. So yeah, it can happen. That's life. Changes. You take to one thing, you take to the next. So I'm happy. Thank you for telling me I'm the first horror writer on your show. So that's a record for me, another record for me.
Yeah, no problem. You're welcome. I was looking for a horror writer to come on for so long, and I asked one or two people who will remain nameless, and they turned me down. So, and I'd been wanting to get you on for so long, and I was like, well, duh, 1+1 = 2. Obviously, I need to get Nuzo on as my first horror writer.
Well, you've gone and ruined everything now. Why did you have to tell me you invited others and they turned you down? And then I'm like, number 3 down the line. Okay. See, you've ruined everything. You should have just kept quiet and not said anything.
Oh my, okay. I have to delete that out. Then.
I'm not even
sorry.
second best now. I'm third best. Well, here we are. At least all's well that ends well.
Exactly. So let's talk about you and your career a little bit first before we get into horror itself. What drew you to writing? What made you the horror writer that you are today?
I think my childhood experiences. I grew up. My earliest recollections were just before the war, and then during the war. During the war, especially when we used to have the Tales by Moonlight sessions, and they were usually all about ghost stories. Inevitably, all ghost stories with songs and everything. And there's this delicious thrill when you're all sat around under the moonlight, and the storyteller, usually my uncle Sebastian, and he's telling the stories, and you're going to be terrified, but you're not alone. Other people are all around you, and you have the treats to look forward to, be it peanuts or roast corn or roast pear. There was always a treat to be given after the ghost stories. And so you could associate the Tales by Moonlight to nice treats. And gradually after the war, when I read my first ghost story by Amos Tutuola, a Nigerian, the writer of The Palm Wine Drinkard and My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, that was an amazing book. It had practically all the ghost stories I heard in my childhood. And to see it down there in black and white in a book, it was mind blowing. It was like, wow. So these stories I heard as a child, they are real. Because for me, anything in a book was truth. The book you grew up knowing, anything in a book meant gospel truth. So seeing those stories in the book that he wrote made me think, oh, they are actually true. These are not just ghost stories, they actually happened. And then as I grew older, of course, you realize, okay, it's fiction. It's a book. But by then, I fell in love with that kind of story, anything to do with ghosts. And when I was in boarding school, by the time I was 12, we had a club called the Club of Young Writers. And we used to just get together and write stories and enjoy ourselves and eat and sing. And that's how it started. And then I gave it up for a while to pursue the different careers I've had along the years. I've worked everywhere. I've worked in the legal profession, I've worked in the music profession, I've worked in the publishing sector, I've been a civil servant, I've run a soda drinks producing company, I've run a slimming club, a self-publishing company, a lingerie boutique, poultry farm, you name it. I've been a bingo worker, I've been a psychic reader. There's nothing I haven't done. And these days, as you know, I'm a civil funeral celebrant. So while pursuing all the other careers, I sort of kept the writing and raising the children, getting married and getting divorced and getting married and getting divorced and raising the kids. You sort of put all that to the side. So I was almost 50 when I decided, okay, now I can go back and study and return to my original passion, which was writing. And so I went back to the university to do a master's in writing and started writing what I was familiar with, what I liked, the genre I liked, which is horror. And not just horror, but I decided to write horror from a culture I knew, our own, because I looked around at the time, and when I did a search of African horror, I didn't find anything, nothing at the time. All you had was like either there's a famine in Zaire, or there's a war in Congo, or there's AIDS in South Africa, or there's just horrible, horrible negative reporting about the continent. Nothing at all about the literary genre, as you would find if you checked Korean horror or Japanese horror or Scandinavian horror. So I began marketing myself under African horror, and here we are today.
That's an amazing story. You've done so much stuff. It's kind of mind-boggling.
I know. I mean, my kids say to me, Mom, you have an addiction to collecting certificates. I've got certification in so many things. It's mind-blowing. I probably don't use half of them for anything, but there's just this joy. This, I think, is the Igbo blood in me. We Igbos are known for having an addiction to studying and collecting certificates. That's probably why if you look in the literary world, you find a lot of the African writers are from my community, the Igbo community, from Chinua Achebe, Chimamanda, Nnezi Okorafor. Practically all of us are from my Igbo community. So I think that's why I keep collecting my certificates. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. I always admire people who are able to do that. Now I've changed careers a couple times, but it's always been kind of related. You know what I mean? It's been like a half step away and a half step away. It's never been like from one thing to another,
Yeah. But that's life. You just have to keep checking. I think that's the thing about we creatives. Yeah. Every creative will tell you that thing. Even when you look at the top actors, they'll tell you that they've been musicians or they've written poems or they've acted. Creatives are always looking for a way to express themselves. So they are not like stuck in a 9-to-5 job. Till you find you find your calling eventually.
So one thing that you mentioned a war back at the beginning of your story of yourself. Now, I've read that you were a refugee early in your life. Would you be willing to talk about that a little bit, and then maybe how that has influenced your writing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, most people know about the Biafran Nigerian Civil War between 1967 and 1970. And that war was what I can call a baptism in fire for every Nigerian child. I mean, children especially. I remember before the war broke out, we lived in the capital city, Enugu, and suddenly we became refugees. The Igbo community, we abandoned everything when the war broke out between us and the Nigerians. And my father from being a lawyer, he became a colonel in the army. And he was absent most of the times, and I just remember that from suddenly living a tranquil, normal life, you find yourself constantly faced with the daily bombs, the daily shootings, the death everywhere. And you're seeing dead people. I never saw dead people till the war started. By the time the war ended, I'd seen enough corpses to last me a lifetime. I remember once watching some screaming and wailing adults dragging out mangled bodies from this red soil bunker that had a direct hit by a Nigerian bomb. And that image always stayed with me. The red, all I can remember is just red mud and blood and bodies and people just screaming. And another time I remember accompanying my mom to visit the site of a plane crash. And I remember seeing the charred boot of the dead pilot whose relief plane had crashed not far from the town we lived in at the time. And I don't know why the boot left a deep impression in my little mind. But I just remember wondering at the time if the dead pilot's foot was still stuck inside that boot or whether it had burnt with the wreckage of the doomed plane. And it always stayed with me, that wrecked plane and the boot there. And I remember a long time after that, I kept having nightmares. And even though the planes, the Nigerian planes and everything was a daily occurrence, I think from the day I saw the wreckage of that relief plane, that's when I became really terrified of planes. After the war, I used to hide and lurk under the bed whenever I had a plane. There was this terror the plane was going to fall and land over me. So it was a horrible war, and several of my relatives and families died in the course of that war. There was little supervision by the adults, with all the able bodied men away fighting. And as a result, I know we Biafran children, we saw and underwent some rather unwholesome things, which I guess all children in war zones experience, but one thing I will say, is that the war wasn't all bad in the end because it influenced my writing in many ways. As I said, it made me the writer I am today because despite the harrowing situation, the Biafran government ensured that we children always attended school. In all the different villages and towns we lived in as refugees, I always went to school. As I said, we Igbo people have this voracious appetite for studying. So the school grounds were places, not just a sanctuary where we were given food by the relief agencies, but we were taught patriotic, anti-Nigerian songs. And they continued with the British colonial education that we were receiving before the outbreak of the war. So I believe the priceless education I received in those 3 years of the civil conflict ensured that I didn't lag behind in my education after the war, and that my ability to write and communicate in the currently dominant, literary language of the world, which is English, was strengthened in those formative years. But as I said, the greatest gift to me in those conflict years was the Tales by Moonlight storytelling sessions. Because those sessions, as I said, the ghost stories we heard that were brimming with superstitions and supernatural vengeance and triumph over evil, good over evil, and of course, we Igbos being fanatical Christian zealots, inevitably Christian religious content would encroach into these fantastical tales. But the ancestors and the gods always played a prominent role as well. So anyone that's read my books would instantly understand the impact of my refugee childhood on my writing, because my stories are always about supernatural vengeance and occultic magic and some malevolent and good ghosts and everything that I heard as a child during those Tales by Moonlight sessions. So yeah, that's how I would say the war impacted and affected my writing today.
Interesting. Wow. That's some really intense stuff, that's for sure. So in your writing, you often really push back on patriarchy in your stories. For example, The Unclean, my favorite story of yours. Why is that?
Well, how do I put it? I grew up in a very patriarchal setting as a child and as an adult, but as a child, my rights as a female child were constantly eroded, both at home and in the wider community. In fact, In my younger years, I remember I used to threaten that I'll reincarnate back as a boy in my next life. That was how frustrated I felt with all the restrictions and all the uncles. There were so many uncles there when I was growing up who were there to basically make my existence a misery. They will tell you that you, as a girl, you're worthless, and I would see my mom popping out daughters in a desperate bid to provide sons for my dad, and she was a fanatical Catholic, my mom, but she kept sneaking out every Sunday to go to her church because my dad was a Protestant. And she being a wife, she wasn't allowed to go to the Protestant church, to the Catholic church. Now she was married to a Protestant man. And my mom used to be a head teacher, but she had to give up her career once she married because, of course, women married to wealthy men in those days weren't allowed to work, since working was an insult to the husband and his ability to provide for his family. Yeah, hell, the good old days. I tell you, I'm so tired of working these days. I wouldn't mind being a kept wife just for a while, right? Anyway, as I was saying, so my personal family dynamics was a very sexist one. And I remember my dad saying to me once when I complained about my marriage, my first marriage, and he said to me I had to stay in that marriage because a woman has no say in her husband's home. In fact, my father's exact words to me was that I should eat whatever dish was served to me by my husband's family at the time. So I became a rebel at a very young age. I used to escape from my boarding school to attend parties with much older kids and, experiment with some stuff. And I got suspended several times from school. And that eventually led to my river exorcism, to cast away the demons possessing me and being responsible for my waywardness. So yes, when I tell people that the unclean is actually fact in many parts, right down to the corpse water fed the widow, which is something that actually happened to a good friend of the family, and that's another example of the patriarchal evils against African women who, till today, still undergo some unbelievable abuses once their husbands die. So as a result of my personal experience and what I witnessed in the wider community and my attempts to push back against it, my female characters in my books are always fighting to break free from these oppressive systems, while the children's voices are savagely suppressed. And I just try to highlight these injustices in my book and the harm that they can wreak on, well, weaker individuals. And so in my stories, I try to give the women and the vulnerable ones, be them the children or the disabled, whatever, I try to give them some form of vengeance in my stories, be it natural or supernatural vengeance. Either way, it doesn't matter. Yeah, so that's why you'll find a lot of that in my book. I think I'm just being authentic to the culture I grew up in. There's no way I can write African horror and try to whitewash it or white paint it and make it look as if everybody's got equality, everything is hunky-dory. That's one thing I always get when people question me. Some Africans say to me, why do you write that? You're portraying us in a negative light. And I'll say, no, it's not being portrayed. I'm just being, that's the truth. Let's not try to blind ourselves to everything and go into denial. It doesn't help.
And I certainly don't think that oppressive gender roles like that are just an African thing. I mean, just here in the United States, as we're recording this, the Supreme Court just
Roe v. Wade.
Yep.
And that's just the beginning. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, in the United States, I know there are some states where women aren't even allowed. There's a law that women can't even cut their hair without their husband permission, or women can't go parachuting or something on a Sunday. A single woman can't do that on a Sunday. There are quite a few funny laws there. Some of them are a bit old, but they are still there in the statutes. And we see all around the world. It's not just in Africa, it's everywhere. I mean, why do we have the Me Too movement?
Yeah.
If there was equality everywhere, there would have been no need for the Me Too movement. But we can only hope, we can only keep, as writers, highlighting those issues and pushing against it, in our work, and hope that things might improve for our children, if not for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you completely. So you mentioned how a lot of the uncles and the men and all this, I mean, really brought these horrific existences to some of the women in your books. And many of the ghosts are actually vengeful ghosts, as you're saying, right? Why do you tend to focus on making the villains the regular people? Why aren't the monsters like the scary things, you know? I mean, they're scary too, don't get me wrong, but they're nowhere near as scary as the people in your books.
Yes. I mean, how do I put it? I think in most horror stories, it's always the people who are the monsters. Think of Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie, Misery, Silence of the Lambs, Rebecca Dumoni's Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. I mean, in so many horror books, we humans are the monsters, because humans can be beautiful and ugly and good and evil. We can be angels, we can be monsters at the same time. I think that's the paradox of our existence. The fact that the evil that humans commit is more terrifying than anything else, for the simple reason that it is not supposed to be that way. We have this unconscious bias that things that look like us should be like us. So, despite all of us sharing this common bond of humanity, the sad thing is that we can't read each other's minds or see what lurks, beneath people's hearts until it's too late. So I always say that what I love most about Stephen King's work is his ability to turn the most mundane things and situations into chilling horror,
Yeah.
and you find fear can be more consuming when it comes from the most unexpected and innocuous source. So when you see, for instance, a regular father sacrificing his own autistic child in a ritual murder with the witch doctor's help, as was in my book, The Sleepless, or you see a whole village enter this pact of silence when a corrupt politician kidnaps a young albino girl and uses her body parts for powerful charms in order to win the election, as in my other book, The Dead Corpse, then you realize that evil can lurk in each of us. It just depends on how far we are ready to go and how strong our wills and society's moral chains are. I always ask my friends, why do you think there are so many religions and laws in the world, if not to sort of contain and rein in the deadly evil in mankind's heart? So yeah, I think our capacity for evil trumps any supernatural monster out there. And anyway, the ghosts I write about, were once humans, right? They were once human beings. So I just think that evil continues in another realm and form, not just here. And because of how evil we are, I think we have more materials. The chilling evil of human beings trumps any other kind of evil, I think.
Yeah. You mentioned religion in there as well, and religion plays a huge role in your stories, but I think in a lot of horror stories, honestly. I mean,
yes.
Why is religion so important to horror?
Um, well, like I said, religion, like I said before, we need religion and the laws, to chain in mankind's proclivity to evil. And I think religion serves as the sentinel, to humans' unpredictable nature. I always say to myself, there must have been a glitch somewhere when we were created. That's if we believe in the doctrine of creation. And this glitch resulted in the yin yang of our minds, or our thinking just got overloaded and crashed, whatever. I don't know. But I always say that history has shown us the unspeakable evil that mankind can, that can infect our souls. And when the dark side escapes. So every culture has now developed its own religious arsenal to combat this evil. From our African, we have our medicine men and rituals, and the Romans and the Greeks had their gods, and the Catholics had their crosses and exorcisms, and the Jewish people had their Torahs and prophets, and the Buddhist priests, the Native American shamans. Everybody's got something to fight evil, a kind of religious arsenal to find evil. So I think also the contrast between the seemingly goodness of religion. I say seemingly goodness because we all know from experience that if there's something that is evil, religion these days are evil, the practice of it. But the contrast of what we've been led to believe, the goodness of religion and the badness of the evil monsters, be them human or otherwise, it never fails to spice up any horror narrative. And not forgetting the fact that religions are always deluged with rituals. And these rituals add that element of mystery and tension when you weave it into a story. I mean, in Africa especially, we have what I call the merging of the received colonial religion of Christianity and the conquest religion of Islam, and then the traditional local religions that we practiced. All three of them have merged hand in hand and has created a kind of hybrid religious practice that truly boggles the mind, especially when it comes to burial practices. You've never seen anything like that. So one can easily find abundant material when writing horror from the ghastly consequences of this mishmash of religions in Africa. So for instance, in The Unclean, you saw the desperate wife, the pretty dubious steps that she took with both the pastor and the witch doctor in a bid to have a son for her husband, and the calamitous consequences of her choices. So yes, religion is always, I always say, is one of the best arsenals for any horror writer. Why do you think The Exorcist and The Omen were so popular and remain classics till today?
Yeah, and The Omen is honestly one of my favorite horror movies. I love that one.
Yeah.
Great answer. So we talk a lot about religion and the different circumstances around it, like the ceremonies, as a way to fight evil, right? And a lot of horror is really about surviving and fighting against evil, right? Do you feel horror also brings hope to the world? Let me give you a little context here. In our first episode ever, it was kind of brought up almost as a joke that you have a horror story where everyone is just murdered, but it can still end up being hopeful. Do you think that horror can bring an element of hope?
Can horror bring an element of hope? I think it depends on the story and the storyteller. Personally, I always say to myself, if the story is one of survival and man's ability to withstand and persist and overcome all odds, and that would bring hope, that would make one feel hopeful that they can overcome the odds, no matter what the odds are. I think anyone that watched or read The Stand, Stephen King's book, The Stand, and you see what happened, and then you say to yourself, okay, if we keep fighting and we never give up hope, we never give up the fight, yeah, that would inspire people to continue and feel energized to fight in any situation they find themselves, rather than giving up hope easily. On the other hand, horror can be debilitating depending on the situation. I found that during the lockdown, for instance, something happened to me, and I found it hard, almost impossible, to read any horror books or watch any horror films, because I was living the horror. I was literally, I used to take a drive, and I would see no cars on the road, and I found it creepy. I felt as if I was in a film I've watched, and this is happening. And I used to say, please, Lord, let me just see this whole thing go, and I'll see cars. I would never complain again if I'm stuck in a traffic jam or anything. Oh, just bring back traffic again, just so human beings exist. So when there is that situation and you are in a hopeless situation, no, I think depending on some people, horror may not be one that would give you hope. And then on the topic you are dealing with, if you're dealing with a topic that has a world, global ramifications, and you're writing about it through the horror medium, then yes, depending on how you tell the story, you might bring hope to a lot of people, So as I said, it depends on the story and the writer and the situation.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. One time I can't remember if I was chatting with Todd A. Thompson or if I heard him talking about it at a conference or something, but he was talking about being Nigerian and how he didn't always like to write in Western style formats. And just to give you an example, the 3-act play is generally considered to be a very Western style of writing, right? Or story structure, maybe, is a better way to phrase it.
Right.
Are you also interested in trying to break out of the Western style of storytelling? And go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely understand, where he's coming from. I always say that the African storytelling style is something that always tends to pop up unexpectedly in the writing of many African writers. And when you first see it, it can throw the audiences who are unused to that style of writing. For instance, a writer like Eugene Bacon, for instance. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She writes sci-fi as well.
Yes.
She's the Australian African writer as well. And she has a unique style of writing that defies all conventions. Her stories sort of tend to flow like a gentle stream, meandering, along curves and literally waterways, and just seamlessly and even at times a bit randomly, but brilliantly unraveling everything without sticking to any fixed conventional writing pathways, like we have. So each time I read her stories, I always say to myself, yeah, I like that. You don't know what to expect. She's not following any format at all. And as far as I know, there's no formal African writing style. No, nothing. Just we have a free will affair, depending on the community telling the story and how you as a writer wish to convey your story to your wider audience. So for many African writers, especially we coming from an oral storytelling tradition, there can be times when we have more of telling instead of showing in our narratives, as you have in the Western format. And personally, I think this enriches the narrative rather than detracting from it. The important thing for me as an African horror writer is not that 3-act format you mentioned or any other set format at all. Just whether or not I tell my story authentically, I can hook my reader's attention and do justice, to the characters that have placed their stories in my hand. I remember one publisher that I quickly abandoned. They had told me that there were some telling rather than showing in parts of my book. They were planning on publishing at the time, and before I pulled the rights. And I remember telling them, please don't judge my work or my unique voice that I write in, or try to amend certain phrases I use, when they were doing their brutal edits. I said to them, don't do that to try and fit in with your sanitized Western formats. It was a struggle for them, to break away from their fixed mindset. And it was equally a struggle for me to mold my work to fit into their narrow expectations. Thankfully, we both parted ways, and I'm glad to say that book was later published by a more, literary aware and what would I say, intellectually open publisher. So I would say to people, yes, be aware that these days we have regional genres, regional horror genres coming from different regions. The voice and the format and the structure and everything will be different. If we've all been conditioned to reading all the books we have here in the West. And now there is an avalanche of books coming from different regions. And that's what makes it exciting, what makes it different, what makes it nice, not knowing what you will discover, what you will find,
Great. Thanks for answering that. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not much of a horror reader. But I have a good friend. One of my best friends is a huge horror fan. So I asked him to give me some questions for our first horror writer on the show. So his 2 questions were, I'll give them to you one at a time. What makes you afraid, and how does that work its way into your fiction?
Okay. Afraid of everything. Everybody that knows me know that. I mean, I had the same question. Somebody asked me that question in one interview, and the headline they put after the interview was, Nuzo Onoh, terrified of planes, heights, oceans, thunder, roaches. I think, yeah. I'm a very superstitious person. And so I'm like a bundle of neuroses. I'm terrified literally of everything, you name it: spiders, darkness, mountains, tall buildings, anything at all petrifies me. I mean, here I am. I'm a civil funeral, celebrant. I go burying dead people.
Yeah.
And each time I go, I have, like yesterday, I had a funeral yesterday, just yesterday. And I remember I walked into the chapel as I normally do before the body arrived to go check the music and everything. And the chapel door was very heavy, a very heavy old oak door. And I left it open. And I went there checking the music all alone in the chapel, the catafalque next to me, everything. Suddenly the door slammed shut with such force. I mean, you've never seen a door that forceful. The noise, the place literally reverberated. Me being the superstitious idiot I am, I just dropped everything and I ran out. As I was running towards the door, I kept saying, oh, what if I get there and it refuses to open? And I'm trapped in here, and a ghost has trapped me in here. My heart was pounding, racing, and I opened the door, and it opened. So I ran into my car, and I sat in my car, my heart pounding, and I said to myself, yeah. Okay, remember this, remember the emotions, remember what you're feeling right now. So if you're writing, you'll be able to say, okay, your breathing is fast. Yeah, your heart is pounding. Yeah, so whenever I get those experiences, it's good because a rational part of my mind is always saying to me, yeah, just remember what you're feeling right now so you can write it when you are writing. I'm petrified of vampires. My daughters laugh at me. They say to me, I never walk at subways in the evenings, even in the daytime, because I'm always afraid of vampires popping out, and I refuse to watch vampire films. Yeah, I mean, I blame Stephen King for that because after reading Salem's Lot, he destroyed me after Salem's Lot. Yeah. So horror is good. My fears are wonderful because they help me, sort of hone in into the emotions I feel. And because so many things frighten me, I always have different emotions when I feel that terror, when I feel that fear. And I can now sort of write down everything, and once the initial thing is gone, that cold part of your mind is saying to you, start writing it down, start remembering everything, watch yourself, listen to yourself, feel what's happening now so you can authentically write. When you're now writing a scary section in your book, you're recalling all those experiences when you were terrified.
I love it. Great. So Scott, I hope you heard that answer. He is also a writer, by the way. He's only published a couple stories, but he's been working really hard. So
what's his name?
Scott Hallam.
Right, Scott Hallam, right.
Yeah. So, okay, here's his other question. Who are your favorite horror authors? And then I added in, aside from Stephen King, because everyone's influenced by Stephen King.
Dear Lord, okay. There's so many of them, I can't even mention all of them, especially these days. I mean, these days we have such an explosion of new horror voices. So I find myself drawn to all the new writers. For example, I don't know if you've heard of V. Castro. She wrote The Queen of the Cicadas. V. Castro's The Queen of the Cicadas. Wow, that book, I mean, it hits every horror nerve possible. In fact, in a way, it reminds me of my own work. And I always say to myself, V. Castro should be called the Queen of Latin American horror. She's Latin American. I mean, that book, you've got supernatural, vengeance, folklore, myth, culture, horror, everything mixed up in it. So, and of course, as I mentioned, Amos Tutuola, the Nigerian author of The Palm Wine Drinkard. He was the first African horror author I ever read, and the one I say that influenced me greatly. He got me into reading and writing horror. Who else? Paul Tremblay. I love Paul Tremblay, especially his book, The Cabin at the End of the World. I mean, that is a modern classic as far as I'm concerned. Jeremy Bates, he wrote Suicide Forest. I love Koji Suzuki, the Japanese writer that wrote The Ring. He wrote Dark Water. My favorite of his book is Dark Water. And of course, Yoko Ogawa, her book Revenge. Tananarive Dew, My favorite of hers is
Uh,
Ghost Summer. I love Ghost Summer. That's one of my favorite. I mean, she's got all these little intimate, lovely notes at the end of each story.
mhm.
Yeah, and she's like one of those writers like Eugene Bacon and Donald, Genechevi Becky, that they straddle genres of horror, fantasy, sci-fi, you know. So yep, I love their stories. Who else do I like? Chinua Achebe, of course. Anne Rice. I love Anne Rice of the Vampire Chronicles. And then I can't finish without mentioning Stephen Pressfield. I don't know if you've heard about Stephen Pressfield. He wrote The Gates of Fire. Now, that book is not per se a horror book, but oh my gosh, the book is awesome because there is horror in every page. It's an example of man's brutality to man. It's the story of the 300 Spartans that died in defense, of during the attack by the Muslim invasion when Ahura
Mhm.
Mazda tried to Muslimize the whole of Europe, and the 300 Spartans fought, by the gates of Thermopylae, and 300 of them died to the last man in defending Europe's Christian heritage. And so that book, Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield, I say to any writer who wants to learn character development, go read that book. It's a book, I just read it over and over again whenever I feel, okay, I'm a bit stuck with characters. Read Stephen Pressfield, Gates of Fire. Yeah, it's my all-time favorite book.
Awesome, thanks. Wow, definitely some new names in there for me, and then some names I've heard before too. So that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, as I've mentioned multiple times now, I don't read much horror, but I want you to tell me why I should read more.
Then I would suggest, first of all, identify the brand of horror that you connect with the most. Ask yourself, do I like psychological horror? Do I enjoy supernatural or ghost horror? Or do I like the slasher, gore horror, or gothic horror, or monster horror, or, sci-fi horror, medical horror? There are so many areas of horror. And unless you find the one that you like, you know, or maybe you like horror from a particular region, be it Korean or African or Japanese, whatever. Identify the one that thrills you, and only then will you enjoy the genre. Enjoy reading it because you're connecting. I like ghost stories. Anything to do with ghosts, I love.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I love Japanese horror. I love Korean horror. And so, yeah, I would read all those and connect with them. But as I said, I haven't been reading a lot of horror these days because since the lockdown, yeah, I'm sort of still trying to get myself back again into reading.
Yeah, it's totally understandable. Totally understandable. I found I am a big Gothic horror fan, and I also like ghost stories a lot too. So I'm right there with you.
Exactly. I love Gothic horror as well. I absolutely love Gothic horror. And if you love that, that is perfect. Go for it then, because then you won't even feel as if you're reading horror. Gothic horror, I find them, I sort of call them gentle horror, those kind of gentle psychological kind of horror thing. That's why I
Hmm.
loved watching Nicole Kidman's film The Others. I don't know, did you watch the film The Others?
I don't think I have.
Yeah, there was like a gothic horror film where they're in this house and she doesn't realize that she's the ghost haunting the house. She thought that the others were the ghosts haunting, not realizing she and her
Oh,
children were the ghosts. The children she killed. She killed her own children. And
okay.
yeah, it's an amazing film, but it has all that gothic energy, the dark gothic thing. Yeah. So if you like gothic film books, read them. They are fun. I love them too.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll have to check out that movie too. That movie sounds cool. All right, so we're coming up on time here. We got to start wrapping it up. I got a couple questions that I ask everybody. The first one is, what is bringing you hope right now? There's a lot of bad stuff going on out there, and this is how we try to always end on a little bit of a hopeful note.
Hmm. Well, in general, for humanity, I'm hoping for a world without, pedophiles and violence, a world without wars and racism and hunger and injustice, and just a world free of climate changes that would destroy the future for our children and every living thing. So I hope for a lot of things, but with everything happening now in the world, I think there's not much hope for any of these things I want being realized in the immediate future. The only thing that gives me hope these days is that there are still good human beings left whose voices and actions continue to fight, the evils in our society. And I think as long as we retain our consciences and we refuse to become blind citizens, basically admiring the emperor in his new clothes, then I think, all might be well for us in time. And maybe not in this timescape, but, in the future, when there's a spiritual awakening. But I mean, I say never give up. For myself as a writer, I feel heartened by the small but positive changes to the publishing industry following the Black Lives Matter movement. And hopefully, I'm saying it won't be a flash in the pan kind of thing, but it might result in more works from underrepresented creatives becoming a staple component, across all the genres. So, as my favorite K-drama people would say, fighting, don't give up.
Right.
We keep hope. Yeah, onward march.
Awesome. Thank you. So do you have any new projects coming up or anything that everyone should keep their eyes out for?
As you know, my book, A Dance for the Dead, is being published. Is the hardcover has already been published, by Stygian Sky Media, and the paperback is being published in October this year. And I've also been commissioned to produce an African horror / Wild Wild West novella, which I'm working on. Yeah, I know it sounds a weird combination, but trust me, I think we have something here. So I'm watching a lot of Westerns. It's a good thing I grew up watching cowboy films. Thanks to Lee Van Cleef. I used to love Lee Van Cleef in my early years. Don't ask me why. Teenage hearts are unfathomable. So now I'm watching a lot of cowboy films, and hopefully you'll get to read the story when it's published. So prepare yourself for this mesh of African horror and the Wild Wild West.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. I'm looking forward to that. And so finally, where can everybody find you on the internet?
I say to everybody, just go to Twitter. My website is undergoing some reconstruction now. So I'm just on Twitter, nowhere else. I don't like social media much. As you can gather, I'm not on Facebook or Instagram or anywhere, just Twitter.
Okay, and your Twitter handle is?
At Nuzo Onoh.
And I'm going to spell that for everybody so that they know.
Yeah.
And Nuzo Onoh is Nuzo Onoh for everybody out there.
And once my website is completed, hopefully in the next couple of months, it will be www.nuzonoh.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. I've loved talking to you about all this stuff. I had a great time.
Thank you, Alan, for having me. Thank you. I loved it. Have a lovely weekend now, yeah?
Yeah, thank you. You too. Okay, and that was our discussion with Nuzo Onoh. Before we continue on, I just want to remind everybody there are numerous ways you can support us. Feel free to share us with your friends on Facebook or Twitter. You can rate and review our podcast anywhere that you listen to your podcast. And if you're wondering how else you can support us, you can check us out on patreon.com/ifthisgoeson. And you can subscribe to us monthly there. We've got all kinds of things. There's multiple tiers to choose from, 5-minute book reviews, Discord, discounts to Rambo, School for Wayward Writers, and our patrons get to pick guests a couple times a year. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, I'll keep this real quick since I'm without a co-host today. In the 100 or so interviews I've conducted since I started this podcast, I'm not sure I've ever interviewed a person with such a rich personal history as Nuzo. Everything from her history with the Nigerian Civil War to her places of employment and the degrees that she's gotten to her fear of everything just makes her into a super fascinating person, in my opinion. Anyway, I'll just quickly wrap up by saying that I'm so glad I was able to bring her on here as my first horror writer. You should definitely go and check out her work. She's in Again Achevway's Dominion anthology, and as of recording this, she was most recently in the 2021 September-October issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. So go out there and check those out if you can find one of those. Pretty great story. All right, as always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon. This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited and produced by Alan Bailey. Our theme music is by Father Flamethrower. Additional music is by Christopher Snydrowski, and outro music by Sable Aradia. Intro by Dave Robison. Special thanks to our guest, Nuzo Onoh. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you again soon.